Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Amanda Lamb. Today, we're going to break down what redistricting is and how it works and what it means to voters. We recently saw the North Carolina Supreme Court do something really unusual: reopen a case it's already ruled on in mid-March. Now, this could impact the 2024 elections, and it made national headlines not just because we're considered a swing state in the presidential race, but because we're also pivotal in deciding which party controls the U.S. House of Representatives. In today's deep dive conversation with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran, who is in the courtroom for these cases, we're going to talk about this issue along with gerrymandering, what they are, and how they affect voting in North Carolina. Will, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thanks.
So this is a really complex topic, and I'm hoping you can help us break it down for our listeners. So what is redistricting and gerrymandering, and why are people so concerned about this issue?
Yeah, so I have spent far too many hours of my life sitting through court cases and legislative hearings and everything about redistricting. So stop me if I get too into the weeds. But at its core, redistricting is just the drawing of the maps that we use for the districts that determine, okay, who is going to represent this part of the state in the state legislature, in Congress. And the big political question here is, should the people who are in charge, which is our state legislature, how much power should they have over this process? And should they be able to have oversight from the courts, or should they be able to just do whatever they want, essentially?
And what is this based on? Is it based on population? I mean, how do they decide where these lines go?
Yeah, so there are some arcane rules that, the courts have laid out over years, because, we've had lawsuits over this just going back for many, many years. But in a sense, yes, it's about population. You hear the phrase one person, one vote thrown out a lot. The idea is to make sure that everyone, is equally represented in Congress and the state legislature.
So what is gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering is when the party in charge decides, hey, we want to tweak these lines to help ourselves out. And so what that might mean is, packing a ton of voters of one political party into one district. So then, even if the state's kind of 50-50 split, you have this one district, and the way it's been done recently is, you pack Democrats into districts, and, so it'll vote like 80-20, for a Democrat. And then, that allows the other districts to vote, maybe like 52-48 for Republicans. And so you can kind of, juice the numbers a little bit to help Republicans. And that's what we've seen recently. And of course, I should add, Democrats did the exact same thing when they were in charge.
So it's really a mathematics game in a way.
Yeah, for sure. There's so much math involved. Yeah.
I wouldn't be good at it. So talk to me about how this relates to the case Moore v. Harper. What is that case, and how does it relate to what we're talking about?
Sure. So people probably remember, if they pay attention to political news or even just the regular national news, because this made national headlines last year. It's a Supreme Court case that originates out of North Carolina but would affect the entire country. And it says basically that when a state legislature wants to do something related to federal elections, then state courts can't step in and say, hey, what you're doing is unconstitutional. So this, for example, was actually kind of a key part in former President Donald Trump's efforts to stay in power after the 2020 elections. Obviously didn't work out for him. It obviously has also tons of ramifications for gerrymandering, and even though it didn't work for Trump in 2020, our state legislature is asking the Supreme Court, hey, we want you guys to put this rule into place for the future. However, since we had this, as you said earlier, this almost unprecedented decision by the Supreme Court to go back and rehear this state level case, because the U.S. Supreme Court case, sorry, this is getting confusing.
So the U.S. Supreme Court case is now rehearing a case.
Right. Yeah. And the U.S. Supreme Court case is based on the state one.
Okay.
And so the fact that the state justices are redoing this made the nation's Supreme Court step in and say, hey, wait a second, do any of the arguments that y'all made even hold up if the state's court ends up reversing the ruling?
Right. So it is very complex. And so basically the lawsuit in front of the state right now is about how the legislature will redraw these maps. Is that
Exactly.
correct? Okay.
Exactly. And so right now we have 14 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, and they are split 7-7. The Republicans won 7 of those seats in 2022, and the Democrats won 7 of those seats in 2022. Those are court-ordered maps because of the lawsuit last year that ruled the original maps that our legislature wanted to draw unconstitutional. And the maps that they wanted to draw originally would have given Republicans at least 10 of those 14 seats and maybe 11 of the 14 as well, even if, the statewide vote was split roughly 50-50. And so that caused our state Supreme Court last year to step in and say, hey, wait a second, this is just completely unfair. If the state's split 50-50 with the voters, why should one party get 11 of the 14 seats? That doesn't make any sense. However, that was when the court had a Democratic majority. Then the elections happened and voters flipped the majority. They put Republicans in control of the court, and the court came in and said, hey, we're going to rehear that case because we don't think that it's the place of the courts to even weigh in on gerrymandering.
But in a way, there just is so much politics involved in this. I mean, you can't ignore that. Anybody who says it's it is partisan, obviously.
Yep. We elect our judges in partisan elections. And, part of the reason helping Republicans flip control of the courts was there were millions and millions of dollars put into the race from, national DC groups who wanted to flip the court specifically for redistricting.
So what is the GOP arguing in this specific case?
They say that the state constitution is pretty clear that it should be the legislature in control of redistricting and the legislature alone. They don't think that there's room for courts to get in here. They think it's just too complicated if you get into this math and to decide, well, what is fair and what isn't fair? Where do you cross that line? They say it's too vague and it's not something that the courts should be involved in at all. And
this isn't the first time we've dealt with gerrymandering in our state, correct? I mean, there have been many issues in the past.
Yes, that is an understatement for sure. Actually, nationwide, a lot of the key national Supreme Court precedents on gerrymandering are all from North Carolina cases dating back, through the 2000s and even the 90s and the 80s. I mean, we're for decades have really been ground zero of how much should politicians be able to get away with?
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute when we get back from our break with Will Doran about what is next in this redistricting debate. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm talking with WRAL's Will Doran about redistricting, what it means to you and me, the voters. And we were talking right before the break about gerrymandering. Why is North Carolina ground zero for so many of these cases? I mean, you say going back decades.
Yeah, well, it's a few things. One, a lot of the cases back in the 80s and 90s were about racial gerrymandering. So, this was coming out of the civil rights movement and, the courts were starting to recognize that, oh, hey, these lawmakers are, North Carolina is a state where almost a quarter of the population is black, and yet they're represented almost entirely by white people, both in Congress and at the state legislature. And so courts started saying, hey, y'all need to address this and, make sure that your black residents have some voice.
So the maps at that time, there was a belief that they were disproportionately allowing white candidates in certain areas, some kind
Correct.
of an advantage over black candidates.
Correct. And we've seen that even, up to the last decade. We, still had racial gerrymandering cases here that the state was losing because the way that they drew the maps was, in such a way that it harmed black voters, in favor of white voters and, gave the one, group a disproportionate voice in state politics. The case that we're talking about now is actually not about racial gerrymandering, but about partisan gerrymandering. And that's a trickier concept because there is so much established law on racial gerrymandering. But partisan gerrymandering, where you have the question of okay, well, is it unfair for the party in charge, even if they're not targeting people by race, are they allowed to target people by their political party? And that's the big question here and now. And the state Supreme Court had said, no, they can't. But now it appears that they might now say, well,
change their minds.
They can. Yeah. So we're just going to have to wait.
I know we're ground zero, but is it happening in other states, these conversations, these debates?
Yes. Some of the big other swing states have this exact same problem. Florida always has lawsuits over these similar issues. Ohio actually has almost the exact same controversy right now that North Carolina is having. And I mentioned with this national U.S. Supreme Court case, it could really open up a can of worms in a ton of other states. You have Democratic-led states like California, for instance, the biggest state in the country, that have tried to take politics out of this by instituting, independent commissions to handle their redistricting instead of letting politicians do it like we do here in North Carolina. But, if Republicans win their Supreme Court case here at the U.S. Supreme Court, then, that could allow, states like California to just really go all in. So, while Republicans could pick up some wins in, here and some other states, they could face the loss of seats in places like California. So, it could just be a whole jumble nationally.
Yeah, it almost seems like a reflection of our political partisan, divide that's happening in this country as we're seeing that happen.
I've had people describe it to me as it would create an arms race to basically see, who could create the most extreme gerrymanders.
Wow. And so what does this mean for our congressional elections next year if the court reverses itself now that the balance of power has changed?
Well, you'd almost certainly see several of our Democratic lawmakers in D.C. lose their elections or, be drawn into such an unfavorable district that they wouldn't even try running again. They would run for something else.
Because it just wouldn't be financially smart to do that if they couldn't be reelected.
Right, exactly. Like I said, right now we have a 7-7 split. But if the maps were drawn so that they basically all but guarantee a 10-4 split, instead, probably you would see, in Wake County, Representative Wiley Nickel, he might be at risk of, having his seat be redrawn. He actually represents, on paper, a slightly right-leaning seat anyways, but it could get redrawn to be really Republican-leaning. Out in Charlotte, you could see Representative Jeff Jackson, Democrat from Charlotte, his seat could get redrawn. In Greensboro, Democratic Representative Kathy Manning's seat could get redrawn. So, kind of all of the major population centers of the state really could
see a big
currently
shift.
have Democratic lawmakers, but, could see them drawn out of their seats.
What about local elections? The governor's race, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question because obviously 2024 is coming up. Roy Cooper is term limited. He can't run again, so we're going to have a brand new governor. We don't know which party they're going to be from yet. We'll have to do the election first to find out. But, obviously Cooper, a big part of his time as governor has been kind of acting as the Democratic Party's last line of defense on some of the things that the Republican-led legislature wants to do. He's mostly just spent his time vetoing bills. He hasn't had a whole ton of, things that he's proposed that he's gotten lawmakers to do. It's more playing defense. But, if the court says, hey, no holds barred on redistricting and, legislature can, have much more free reign to draw the lines that they want. That doesn't just apply to Congress. That also applies to their own seats in the state legislature. So they could potentially give themselves big enough majorities that they would be able to override any veto from the governor as long as all Republicans stuck together, which they typically do.
So what's next?
Well, we're going to wait and see what the court says and then wait and see what happens in the elections. The court doesn't have a deadline to issue a ruling on this. However, none of the facts have changed from when this was already heard last year. The justices already know all of the issues. So, we'd probably expect a new ruling to come out pretty soon. And if that happens, by this summer or even this fall, then that gives the legislature plenty of time to potentially draw new maps, well in advance of the 2024 elections.
Well, thank you so much. I know you're going to keep up on this. Well, thanks for your time and insight into this very complex issue and explaining it for all of us and breaking it down.
Thank you. It is very complex, so I hope it's been helpful.
Yeah, it has been, and we'll continue to follow it. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and making us part of your morning routine. If you like what you're hearing, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email waiting in your inbox every morning with Triangle news events and headlines to get you ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.